Welcome to episode 3, the first VHIA update for 2017. My name is Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHIA. Today we'll start with the industrial update. The Nurses Enterprise Agreement has been approved by the Fair Work Commission and commenced operating on the 23rd of December 2016. The Allied Health Professionals Agreement has been lodged with the Fair Work Commission and we are currently awaiting a date for approval. However, members should note that the government has approved payments, including the one-off payment with respect to that agreement, and those payments can be progressed now. Members will have received by now a translation guide that will assist in the calculation of back pay. The Health and Allied Services Managers and Administrative Workers Agreement came into operation on the 15th of December 2016. However, the first reference group meeting has been rescheduled to Thursday the 9th of February. The purpose of the reference group, as with all our reference groups, will be to focus on the key implementation issues that arise from that agreement. With respect to the mental health agreement, drafting continued over the Christmas period, but as of now, I can advise you that the drafting has been finalised and members will have received the materials for distribution for ballot for that particular agreement. What we do intend to do, though, is that during the life of the agreement is to review its terms and the drafting with a view to simplifying that agreement the next time around. With respect to the Medical Scientists Agreement, negotiations did continue over December and January. Good progress is being made and we hope to have a more complete update with regards to that agreement shortly. For our standalone community health members, the discussions regarding the Social and Community Services Agreement have taken priority and members will have received from us updates on the 2nd and 9th of January. We have received a number of inquiries with regards to those materials and we have prepared a video presentation which is posted on our website that should assist in answering the queries that members have with regards to that important material. And finally, just generally speaking, we have received a number of inquiries from members with regards to the public holidays and in particular the 25th of December and its status as an additional day. We are currently reviewing those inquiries and will provide further clarification with regards to those matters if it's required. And shortly we'll be providing further information to members with regards to VHIA Community, which will be accessible through a phone app either through Apple or Android, which will be a further way in which members can keep connected to the latest updates with regards to our activities. Joining me for this week's in-depth discussion is Tim Nagle. Welcome, Tim.
It's good to be here, Stuart.
So in terms of our topic for this week, it's under the box as usual. So if you could just describe to those people who are listening on podcast what it is you see.
I see a ninja.
Not a ninja, a soldier, Tim.
Okay.
And that's a result of my mistake. I had confused strike force with task force. So the subject for today is the Nurse and Midwife to Patient Ratio Improvement Taskforce. You may recall that the government had made a commitment to consider improvements to ratios over time. And late last year, they had established a task force for that purpose. It seems strange that we should begin the year talking about the Safe Patient Care Act because that's the way we finished last year. Just for the benefit of those people who may not remember, we had a discussion about the Safe Patient Care Act and its looming first anniversary. Could you just let people know where that process with regards to that first anniversary has got to?
Yeah, so the first anniversary occurred on the 23rd of December last year, and this date signified the date where people had an opportunity to enter into a local agreement with the union and staff about below ratio CWMAs or other elements where the ratios were varied due to local circumstances.
So the 23rd of December being the first anniversary of the Safe Patient Care Act and the end of that grace period, also the date on which the new Nurses Enterprise Agreement came into effect. A coincidence or perhaps by design? Are there any other themes?
No, not really. In terms of, it was just coincidental that they did occur on the same date. There was no evil plan behind that. But in terms of where we're up to, it really signifies the commencement of the Safe Patient Care Act proper, in that first year is now behind us and we're moving forward with the provisions in the Act.
It's interesting that bringing us back to the present, that what we have is a task force rather than a review. For me, the term task force denotes some kind of action. It also denotes the possibility that it may kick down your door without any notice. But that task force is now in the process of calling for submissions.
Yes, and it's really around the improvements to the ratios. I agree with your observations about there being a place also for review of the operation of the Act as well.
In terms of the form for those submissions, my observation would be that the form for submissions is quite constrained.
It is. There's a template for people to fill out, so it really guides people in what the submission they make is.
So just talking about that template for the submissions for a moment, as I understand it requires that your proposal to improve ratios must address certain matters. That includes not only the rationale, but things such as quality of patient care matters, including falls, sepsis, thrombosis, pressure injuries, pneumonia, urinary tract infections, all in relation to the proposed area affected by the application. In another way of putting it is that those are the nurse sensitive indicators that many members will be familiar with.
Yeah, that's right. So the nurse sensitive indicators form the basis for some research about staffing levels, etc. So the calling for submissions is based upon those nurse sensitive indicators.
The template also seeks comments with regards to the changing patient profile, such as age, length of stay, the case mix and throughput, as well as other matters such as the capacity of nurses and midwives to complete their duties during the rostered hours. Those considerations sound incredibly familiar. Yes,
so I mean, we know that those were the considerations that have been used in previous agreements. And really they reflect some of the key elements of workload that we would expect in circumstances where workload to staffing arrangements are connected.
So in effect, the form for submission with regards to the task force is a giant Clause 42 proposal.
Yes, and that's how you could describe it. I mean, many of the factors that we've come to recognise as part of a Clause 42 are in fact part of this submission document.
The only one that I noticed was missing was the requirement to comment or engage with staff engagement. That's not a requirement of the template proposal process for the task force.
No, that's true. It's not.
So I understand that the task force has commenced receiving submissions from November, and those submissions close, I think, in next month, in February?
Yes. February 6th, I think.
6th of February, and the task force continues to operate through to December 2017. So as I understand it, that process will include a process for consultation in the event that submissions are made by one party that affects another party, and that party will get a chance then to potentially to comment on that submission.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I mean, the Safe Patient Care Act provisions do have a wide-ranging effect on both employers, employees and their organisations. So it is proper that all organisations or stakeholders are able to comment on submissions made.
I think what's interesting for me is that there is a request for submissions for improvements to ratios without there having been an evidence-based evaluation of the existing ratios, and that might have been a useful tool by which to identify areas for potential improvement.
I would have thought so. I mean, it's difficult. I would have thought it was difficult to extend ratios if there's no process for evaluating the current ratio. So I'm not sure whether that's going to be part of the process or not, but I assume that there has to be a degree of that.
We spoke before about the first anniversary process for the Safe Patient Care Act that you were involved in. Were there any issues arising from that process that will be relevant to submissions for the task force?
Well, I mean, there were areas where there was more attention than others. For instance, maternity services was an area where there was a lot of activity.
Could you remind people what the issues were with regards to the maternity services?
So the maternity services issues were based upon the fact that the Safe Patient Care Act made a distinction between nurse to patient ratios and midwife to patient ratios. So in terms of a pure compliance perspective, if there was direct entry midwives in special care nursery, for instance, then they would not be counted towards meeting the ratios. And the other side of that is registered nurses who aren't midwives working in postnatal delivery or postnatal units would not be counted within the midwife to patient ratios.
In effect, that required local agreements in order to ensure that existing clinical models weren't disrupted.
That's right. So you may have had nurses or midwives working in those areas for some time, for 10 years or so. So what the Act required is for the parties to enter into a local agreement to preserve those clinical arrangements.
And are there any other areas that you think are likely to be the area or subjects for submissions to the task force?
Well, aged care probably comes to mind as an area that may attract some submissions. We know through our enterprise bargaining round that the distinction between high care and low care was noted, and the parties undertook to do some further work in that area. Currently, it's only the high care, or traditionally what was known as high care, that are subject to the nurse to patient ratios and not the low care. So with the change in circumstances, both those areas are becoming more equivalent. So I would imagine that aged care, particularly low care, is an area that will receive further attention.
The interesting thing for me with regards to aged care ratios and the preserved distinction between high and low care is that it has a distorting effect in that you have all the personal care workers at one end of the building potentially and all the nurses at another, where ideally perhaps a mix of those skills across the entire facility might be appropriate.
That's right, and that goes to evaluating the current nurse to patient ratio. So it would be difficult to assess the applicability of those ratios in low care if there was not a corresponding review of the ratios in high care.
For me, there are a couple of other things that I think are relevant in terms of the review process, although the task force template makes it a little bit hard to make submissions on these areas. But ultimately, given that ratios provide that safeguard, that safety net, how technology might be utilised in terms of identifying changes within the organisation and responding in a more demand-driven sense with regards to that resource.
Yeah, I think that as we know, ratios do rely on historical arrangements, so it would be useful to have some sort of mechanism to ensure that the contemporary situation within any unit is what's taken into consideration for the purpose of workload management.
It's certainly the case that the technology has had an ability to change work in a whole range of areas. And there's probably no reason to think that all the data that's accumulated by hospitals in the way that they do couldn't be put to good use for the purposes of workload.
That's right, and particularly in aged care, we know that in aged care there's a lot of data collected about individual residents and workload, etc. So, I mean, the data exists. Yeah.
Look, for me, the other key area is that the template doesn't really lend itself to this kind of submission, but along the lines of ensuring that what is an historical practice does not become the new ratio. We all know that people staff above ratios in certain circumstances where it's appropriate to do so, and that's about exercising a degree of clinical judgment, but that it doesn't necessarily follow that needs to be legislated.
No, I think that's an important point to make, is that we don't want to create barriers to people putting in additional resources, and certainly not the threat of creating a new baseline certainly shouldn't be something that hangs over people's decisions whether to allocate additional resources or not, whether in the short term or the long term.
It's an interesting thing. The needs within a hospital and within a ward might change at a moment's notice, but of course legislation doesn't change that way.
That's right, yes. So some sort of contemporary process for evaluating workload is essential, I think.
So we're in the process at the moment of preparing our submissions to the task force. What steps have been undertaken so far?
Well, we're very lucky in a way that we've lived it for some time now. So for the last 18 months, we really have been immersed in the legislation, and some of the issues associated with the implementation of those ratios. So we've had a lot of experience. We're also fortunate enough to have a lot of ties to the industry at a number of levels. So we've got a lot of experience that we can draw upon with that submission process. So in terms of where we're up to at the moment, we're in the process of collaborating with our stakeholders and members and developing some submissions to feed into the task force.
All right, so the 6th of February looms large and will soon be upon us.
Yes, so I think it's 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks away. So yes, I mean that will be our focus in terms of the coming weeks, about ensuring that those submissions are as on point as possible.
All right. Well, all that remains is for us to, I think, technically speaking, when a member of the task force is over and done with, and when they're no longer required, I think you're supposed to tip them over. Tim, would you like to do the honours? Okay. Thanks very much for joining me, Tim.
Thank you, Stuart. My pleasure.